In 1850, the cotton fields of Wilcox County, Alabama, stretched endlessly under a merciless sun that seemed to burn not just the earth, but the very souls of those who worked beneath it. The Blackwood plantation stood as a monument to prosperity built on suffering, its white-columned mansion rising like a spectre above the quarters where enslaved families lived in conditions that defied human dignity. It was here, among the whispered prayers and stifled sobs that echoed through the slave cabins each night, that a question would be asked, a question so simple yet so devastating that it would unravel secrets buried deeper than any grave. The boy who would ask this question was named Samuel. Born into bondage in 1842, he had known no world beyond the plantation's borders, no reality other than the one dictated by the crack of an overseer's whip and the endless rhythm of cotton picking. His mother, a woman called Celia by the masters, though her real name had been stolen along with her freedom, worked in the plantation house as a cook and seamstress. She was known for her silence, for the way she moved through the mansion like a ghost, her eyes always downcast, her voice never rising above a whisper. What made Samuel different, what marked him from birth in ways that both protected and endangered him, was his appearance. While his mother's skin bore the rich darkness that proclaimed her African heritage, Samuel's complexion was lighter, his features sharper, his hair softer in texture. In the brutal mathematics of slavery, where bloodline determined fate, Samuel occupied a dangerous middle ground, too dark to be free, too light to be ignored. The other children in the quarters whispered about Samuel when they thought he couldn't hear. They spoke of how Master Josiah Blackwood would sometimes stop during his inspections of the slave quarters and stare at the boy with an expression that was neither kindness nor cruelty, but something far more complex and troubling. The adults would quickly silence such talk, their faces growing hard with fear, but children see what adults pretend not to notice, and Samuel began to understand that his existence was somehow different, somehow wrong, in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. Celia had spent 8 years crafting careful lies and half-truths to protect her son from a reality that would have destroyed his young mind. When Samuel asked why his skin was different from hers, she told him that God painted all his children in different colors, like flowers in a garden. When he wondered why the master never looked directly at him but never punished him either, she said that some people were simply blessed with invisible protection. These explanations satisfied a child's curiosity, but as Samuel grew older and more observant, the questions became harder to deflect. The plantation house where Celia worked was a world unto itself, filled with fine furniture imported from Europe and portraits of Blackwood ancestors whose pale eyes seemed to follow visitors through every room. Master Josiah was a man of 43 years, unmarried despite the social expectations of his class and wealth. His sister, Margaret Blackwood, served as the plantation's mistress, managing the household with an iron fist wrapped in silk gloves. She was known for her charitable work among the local congregation and her strict adherence to moral principles, yet there were whispers among the slaves about the true nature of the Blackwood family's piety. The overseer, a brutal man named Hayes, who had worked plantations from Virginia to Louisiana, ruled the fields with a cruelty that was legendary even in a time when such cruelty was commonplace. He carried a whip that he called his teacher and claimed it could educate any slave in proper behavior within 3 strokes. The slaves called him the devil's right hand, and mothers would quiet crying children by threatening that Hayes would hear them. But even Hayes, for all his power and sadistic authority, seemed to understand that certain slaves were not to be touched, and Samuel was one of them. Life on the plantation followed rhythms as old as the institution of slavery itself. Before dawn, the horn would sound, calling the field hands to another day of back-breaking labor. Children like Samuel were not yet old enough for the fields, But they had their own tasks, feeding chickens, gathering eggs, helping with the endless washing that kept the plantation running. It was during these daily routines that Samuel began to notice patterns that troubled him, coincidences that seemed too frequent to be mere chance. There was the way Master Blackwood would find excuses to visit the kitchen when Celia was working, lingering over conversations about household matters that could have been settled in moments. There was the peculiar protection that surrounded Samuel and his mother, an invisible shield that kept them from the worst punishments even when other slaves suffered for lesser infractions. And there was something in his mother's eyes whenever the master was near, not fear, which would have been natural, but a kind of desperate sadness that suggested a wound that would never heal. The other slave children had their own observations, shared in whispered conversations when adults were out of earshot. They spoke of seeing Master Blackwood standing in the shadows of the quarters late at night, not inspecting or threatening, but simply watching. They described the way he would sometimes reach toward Samuel as if to touch his hair or face, then catch himself and pull his hand away. These were dangerous observations, the kind that could get a slave killed if overheard by the wrong ears. But children are natural detectives, and the mystery of Samuel's place in the plantation hierarchy fascinated and frightened them in equal measure. Celia's protective instincts had been honed by years of navigating the treacherous waters of plantation life. She knew that her son's resemblance to Master Blackwood was becoming more pronounced with each passing year, and she understood the implications of that resemblance in ways that Samuel could not yet grasp. The boy was a walking reminder of shameful secrets, a living testimony to the hypocrisy that plagued even the most supposedly righteous households in the antebellum South. In the slave quarters, where privacy was a luxury that didn't exist, and every conversation could be overheard by hostile ears, Celia had perfected the art of silence. She moved through her days like a woman walking on ice, always conscious that one wrong step could send her and her son plummeting into an abyss from which there would be no return. She cooked the master's meals, mended his clothes, and maintained his household with the skill and discretion that had kept her alive for nearly 3 decades of bondage. But children, no matter how well protected, eventually asked the questions that adults most fear to answer, and in the spring of 1850, as Samuel approached his 8th birthday, and his resemblance to Master Blackwood became undeniable to anyone with eyes to see, the moment that Celia had dreaded finally arrived. It was a Tuesday morning in May, the kind of day when the Alabama heat was just beginning to build toward the crushing intensity of summer. Samuel had been sent to gather herbs from the kitchen garden, a task that allowed him to move through areas of the plantation normally forbidden to slave children. As he worked among the neat rows of sage and thyme, he heard voices coming from the master's study, voices raised in what sounded like an argument between Master Blackwood and his sister Margaret. The window was open to catch the morning breeze, and Samuel, with the natural curiosity of childhood, found himself drawn to listen. What he heard would change his understanding of his world forever, though the full implications would take years to unfold. "The boy grows more like you every day." Margaret's voice was sharp with accusation. "People are beginning to notice. The pastor mentioned it just last Sunday, asking after your young relation. How much longer do you think this charade can continue?" Master Blackwood's response was muffled, but Samuel caught fragments. "My responsibility cannot simply—" And then, more clearly, "He is my son, Margaret. Whatever his circumstances, whatever his mother's station, he carries my blood." The words hit Samuel like a physical blow. He dropped the basket of herbs, scattering them across the garden path, and ran. He ran through the carefully maintained grounds of the plantation house, past the stables where horses worth more than human lives were groomed and fed, past the smokehouse where meat was cured for the master's table, while slave children went hungry. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs gave out, collapsing finally in the shade of an old oak tree that had stood sentinel over the plantation since before the first slaves arrived. When Celia found him there hours later, his face was streaked with tears and dirt, his small body shaking with sobs he couldn't control. She knelt beside him in the red Alabama clay, her own heart breaking as she realized that the careful wall of protection she had built around her son's innocence had finally crumbled. "Mama," Samuel whispered, his voice hoarse from crying, "why does the master look like me?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a fire that couldn't be extinguished. Celia looked into her son's eyes that were hazel like his father's, not brown like her own, and knew that the time for protective lies had passed. The truth was about to emerge, bringing with it consequences that neither she nor Samuel could yet imagine. In the distance, the plantation bell rang, calling slaves back to work. But for this moment, mother and son remained frozen in time, balanced on the edge of a revelation that would expose the deepest hypocrisies of their world. The boy who had lived his entire life as property was about to learn that he was also the master's son, a truth that would make him neither free nor slave, but something far more dangerous, living evidence of the moral corruption that infected even the most God-fearing households in the American South. The oak tree under which they sat had witnessed generations of such moments, had sheltered countless conversations between mothers and children forced to navigate the impossible maze of slavery's contradictions. Its branches had heard whispered prayers for freedom, desperate plans for escape, and quiet moments of love stolen from a system designed to destroy the bonds between families. Now it would witness another kind of breaking, as an 8-year-old boy began to understand the true nature of the world into which he had been born. As the sun climbed higher in the Alabama sky, casting harsh shadows across the plantation grounds, Celia made a decision that would change both their lives forever. She would tell Samuel the truth. Not all of it, for he was still too young for the full horror of her story, but enough to help him understand his place in a world that saw him as both victim and threat. It was a conversation that would echo through the years to come, shaping the boy's understanding of justice, power, and the terrible price of secrets kept too long. The plantation around them continued its daily routine, unaware that in the shade of an ancient oak tree, a mother was about to explain to her son why he carried the face of his oppressor, and why that resemblance would make his life more dangerous with each passing year. The truth that had been hidden for 8 years was finally demanding to be heard, and with it would come consequences that no one, not Celia, not Samuel, and certainly not Master Josiah Blackwood, could fully predict or control. In the months that followed Samuel's devastating discovery, the careful balance that had maintained an uneasy peace on the Blackwood plantation began to shift in ways both subtle and profound. The boy's newfound knowledge changed him, aging his features in a manner that had nothing to do with the passage of time and everything to do with the burden of understanding truths that no child should carry. His resemblance to Master Blackwood, always present but somehow overlooked in the willful blindness that slavery demanded, now seemed impossible to ignore. Celia had done her best to explain the inexplicable, choosing her words with the care of someone defusing a bomb. She told Samuel that sometimes powerful men took what they wanted from powerless women, that children born from such unions lived in a world between worlds, belonging fully to neither. She spoke of love where it existed and survival where love was impossible, crafting a narrative that preserved some remnant of her son's innocence while preparing him for the realities he would face. But children understand more than adults often realize, and Samuel grasped the implications of his mother's careful explanations with a clarity that terrified her. He began to see the plantation differently, noticing the way other light-skinned slaves moved through their days with a particular kind of wariness, understanding for the first time that he was not unique in carrying the bloodline of his oppressors. The revelation opened his eyes to patterns that had always been present but had previously existed beyond his comprehension. Master Blackwood himself seemed to sense that something had changed in the atmosphere of his domain. During his daily inspections of the plantation, his eyes would linger on Samuel with an expression that mixed guilt, possession, and something that might have been called affection in different circumstances. The master began leaving small gifts where the boy might find them: a carved wooden horse, a book of Bible stories, sweetmeats from the kitchen that were meant only for the master's table. These offerings were never given directly, always discovered as if by accident, maintaining the fiction that the relationship between them did not exist. Margaret Blackwood, ever watchful of her brother's behavior and acutely aware of the potential scandal that Samuel represented, began pressuring Josiah to make decisions that had been postponed too long. She spoke of selling Celia and Samuel to distant plantations, of the necessity of removing temptation and evidence from their lives. Her words carried the cold pragmatism of a woman who understood that reputation in their social circle was more valuable than human life, and that Samuel's continued presence threatened both. The other slaves watched these developments with the keen attention of people whose survival depended on reading the emotional currents of their masters. They recognized the signs of approaching change, the subtle tensions that preceded major upheavals in plantation life. In the quarters, conversations grew more hushed, and parents held their children closer, understanding that whatever storm was building around Samuel and Celia might sweep others along in its wake. Samuel himself began to withdraw from the casual friendships he had enjoyed with other slave children. The knowledge of his parentage created a barrier that he couldn't cross, making him feel simultaneously superior and inferior, protected and endangered. He found himself studying Master Blackwood's face during the man's visits to the kitchen, searching for resemblances and differences, trying to understand what it meant to carry the blood of both oppressor and oppressed in his veins. The boy's behavior became a source of growing concern for Celia. She watched her son struggle with questions that had no easy answers, observed him wrestling with concepts of identity and belonging that challenged the very foundations of their world. Samuel would sometimes ask why God would allow such confusion to exist, why he had been born into circumstances that made him neither fully one thing nor another. These were theological questions that tested even Celia's deep faith, forcing her to confront doubts about divine justice that she had spent years suppressing. As summer progressed and the cotton plants grew tall in the Alabama heat, tensions throughout the plantation continued to escalate. Rumors began circulating among neighboring plantations about the situation at Blackwood, whispers that suggested the master's moral failings were becoming public knowledge. These stories threatened not just Josiah's reputation, but his standing in a community where maintaining the fiction of racial purity was essential to preserving the entire social order. The overseer Hayes, whose brutal efficiency had always been appreciated by Master Blackwood, began making suggestions about resolving the problem that Samuel represented. His recommendations carried the subtle menace of a man who understood that problems could be made to disappear in ways that left no evidence behind. Hayes had worked plantations where inconvenient slaves had simply vanished, their absence explained by claims of escape attempts or fatal accidents. His willingness to employ such methods was part of what made him valuable to plantation owners who sometimes needed their consciences cleared along with their account books. During this period, Samuel began experiencing nightmares that reflected his growing understanding of his precarious position. He would wake in the small hours of the morning, crying out from dreams where he was chased by faceless figures through endless cotton fields, or where he stood before mirrors that showed him faces he didn't recognize. Celia would comfort him as best she could, but she knew that her son was grappling with psychological wounds that her love alone could not heal. The kitchen where Celia worked became a stage for increasingly tense encounters between her and Master Blackwood. He would find excuses to linger during his visits, sometimes attempting conversations that approached acknowledgement of their situation without ever stating it directly. These interactions were torture for Celia, who understood that any word or gesture could be misinterpreted with fatal consequences. She maintained her facade of respectful subservience while protecting herself and Samuel from implications that could destroy them both. Margaret Blackwood's pressure on her brother intensified as she received reports from friends and acquaintances about the rumors circulating in their social circles. She spoke of family honor and Christian duty, arguing that allowing such a situation to continue was not just socially unacceptable, but morally corrupt. Her arguments carried weight because they reflected genuine concerns about the sustainability of their way of life in a society increasingly questioned by outside forces. Samuel, meanwhile, began seeking knowledge in ways that worried his mother profoundly. He would listen at doors and windows, gathering fragments of conversations that painted ever clearer pictures of his situation. He learned about other plantation children who resembled their masters, about the various fates that awaited such living evidence of slavery's moral contradictions. Some were sold away to distant locations where their parentage would not be recognized. Others simply disappeared under circumstances that were never fully explained. A rare few were educated and freed, though such outcomes were exceptional rather than typical. The boy's growing awareness of these possibilities filled him with a mixture of hope and terror. He began to understand that his future would be determined not by his own desires or actions, but by calculations involving reputation, convenience, and the complex emotional needs of people who viewed him as both son and property. The contradiction inherent in his existence, being simultaneously valued and expendable, created a psychological burden that no child should carry. As autumn approached and the cotton harvest neared, decisions that had been postponed throughout the summer could no longer be delayed. The plantation's annual cycle demanded attention to practical matters, and Samuel's situation had become too prominent to ignore indefinitely. Whether through sale, education, or other means, his presence in the delicate ecosystem of Blackwood Plantation would have to be addressed before the social tensions it created reached a breaking point that could destroy everything Master Blackwood had built. The stage was being set for confrontations that would force all parties to confront truths they had spent years avoiding. Revelations that would expose the fundamental contradictions of a society built on the fiction that human beings could be owned while maintaining that all humans were created in God's image. The questions that Samuel had begun asking would demand answers that would challenge not just individual consciences, but the entire moral framework of antebellum Southern society. The cotton harvest of 1850 brought with it the kind of frenzied activity that typically consumed all attention on the plantation. From dawn until well past dusk, every able-bodied slave worked to bring in the crop that would determine the year's profits and, by extension, the conditions under which they would live through the coming winter. It was during this period of intense labor and distraction that Master Blackwood made a decision that would change the trajectory of Samuel's life in ways that no one could have anticipated. Rather than selling Samuel and Celia to distant plantations as his sister had urged, Josiah chose a different path, one that reflected both his genuine affection for his son and his desire to maintain some degree of control over a situation that had grown increasingly uncomfortable. He approached Dr. Elias Weatherby, the plantation's physician and one of the few men in Wilcox County whose discretion could be trusted absolutely, with a proposal that would test the boundaries of what was socially acceptable, even in their permissive society. Dr. Weatherby was a man in his 60s, educated at Harvard Medical School before returning to Alabama to minister to the health needs of the planter class. He had delivered hundreds of babies, both white and black, and had long ago ceased to be surprised by the complexities of plantation family structures. His medical practice had made him privy to secrets that could have destroyed dozens of prominent families, and his continued prosperity depended on his ability to provide solutions to problems that could not be discussed in polite society. The arrangement that Josiah proposed was elegant in its simplicity and revolutionary in its implications. Samuel would be removed from the plantation environment, but not sold away to unknown masters. Instead, he would be sent to Dr. Weatherby's household in the county seat of Camden, where he would serve as a house servant while secretly receiving the education typically reserved for white children. The fiction would be maintained that Samuel was simply another slave being trained for more sophisticated household duties, but in reality, he would be learning to read, write, and calculate in preparation for a future that remained undefined, but held possibilities that no slave child could normally imagine. Celia received news of this decision with emotions so complex that she struggled to process them. Relief that her son would be removed from the immediate danger of his situation, mixed with terror at the prospect of separation. Joy at the possibility of Samuel receiving an education competed with fear that this unusual arrangement would ultimately place him in even greater peril. She understood that Josiah's plan represented both an unprecedented opportunity and a gamble that could cost Samuel his life if it were discovered by the wrong people. The final weeks before Samuel's departure were marked by a kind of controlled hysteria that affected everyone aware of the situation. Celia spent her days teaching Samuel every lesson she could think of about surviving in a world that would view his education as both valuable and dangerous. She spoke about the importance of never revealing the full extent of his learning, of understanding when knowledge should be displayed and when it should be hidden. These were survival skills that no mother should have to teach her child. But Celia had long ago learned that normal parenting was a luxury unavailable to slaves. Samuel himself experienced this transition period as a series of conflicting emotions that left him exhausted and confused. The prospect of leaving his mother filled him with dread, but the possibility of learning to read and write sparked excitement that he struggled to contain. He had seen how literacy transformed the few slaves who possessed it, giving them power and opportunities that remained invisible to those who could not access the written word. At the same time, he understood that his education would make him different from other slaves in ways that could prove dangerous. Master Blackwood's behavior during this period reflected his own internal struggles with the decision he had made. He found himself seeking opportunities to speak with Samuel, offering advice and encouragement, while maintaining the pretense that their relationship was nothing more than that of a benevolent master preparing a favored slave for advancement. These conversations were awkward and painful for both participants, representing the closest they had ever come to acknowledging the truth of their connection, while still maintaining the fiction that kept them both safe. Margaret Blackwood watched these preparations with deep misgivings, understanding that her brother's plan represented a dangerous deviation from established social norms. She worried that education would make Samuel dissatisfied with his station, that knowledge would create expectations that could never be fulfilled within the constraints of their society. Her concerns were not entirely selfish. She had observed other educated slaves struggle with the psychological burden of understanding their situation too clearly, some driven to desperation by their inability to reconcile their capabilities with their circumstances. The other slaves on the plantation observed Samuel's impending departure with the mixture of curiosity and caution that characterized their response to any unusual development. Some viewed his selection for household service as evidence of favoritism that they could not openly acknowledge but privately resented. Others understood the true nature of his situation and worried about the precedent his education might set, fearing that it could disrupt the careful balance that allowed their community to function within the brutal constraints of slavery. Dr. Weatherby, meanwhile, was making his own preparations for Samuel's arrival. His household already included 2 educated slaves, a man named Augustus, who served as his medical assistant, and a woman called Prudence, who managed his correspondence and accounts. Both had been trained by Weatherby himself and represented examples of how education could benefit slaves while serving their master's interests. The doctor believed that Samuel's quick intelligence and unusual background would allow him to excel in this environment, though he also understood the unique challenges the boy would face. The doctor's own motivations for accepting Josiah's proposal were complex. Professional curiosity played a role. He was genuinely interested in observing how a child of mixed heritage would respond to formal education. Financial incentives were also present, as Josiah had offered substantial compensation for Samuel's care and training. But perhaps most importantly, Weatherby was intrigued by the experimental nature of the arrangement, viewing it as an opportunity to test theories about human potential that were beginning to emerge in educated circles throughout the country. As the day of Samuel's departure approached, Celia found herself caught between desperate desire to keep her son close and recognition that this opportunity might represent his only chance for a life beyond the crushing limitations of field slavery. She spent hours teaching him prayers and songs that would help him remember her love during the years of separation they both knew lay ahead. These intimate moments were precious beyond measure, representing the last time they would be able to share affection openly without fear of observation or misinterpretation. The logistics of Samuel's transfer were carefully managed to minimize attention and speculation. He would travel to Camden in Dr. Weatherby's carriage, ostensibly accompanying the doctor on one of his regular visits to patients in the county seat. Once there, he would simply disappear into the doctor's household, becoming part of a domestic staff large enough to absorb one additional member without attracting notice. The fiction would be maintained that he had been purchased by Weatherby for his medical knowledge and training capabilities. On the morning of his departure, Samuel stood in the kitchen where his mother had worked for so many years, surrounded by familiar sights and smells that he was seeing for the last time as a child. The weight of the moment pressed down on him with an intensity that made it difficult to breathe. He understood that he was crossing a threshold from which there could be no return, leaving behind not just his mother and the only home he had ever known, but his entire identity as he had understood it. Celia's farewell was necessarily brief and seemingly casual, conducted under the watchful eyes of household staff who could not be trusted with the truth of their relationship. She pressed a small cloth bundle into Samuel's hands, containing items that would help him remember her during the long separation ahead. Her final words were spoken in a whisper that carried all the love and hope and terror she felt. Remember who you are, child. Remember that you are loved, no matter what else happens. As Dr. Weatherby's carriage rolled away from the plantation, carrying Samuel toward a future that remained unwritten and uncertain, those left behind struggled to adjust to an absence that created ripples throughout the entire community. Celia would return to her duties with the mechanical efficiency of someone functioning despite profound loss. Master Blackwood would throw himself into plantation business with unusual intensity, trying to escape the guilt and uncertainty that Samuel's departure had intensified rather than resolved. and Margaret Blackwood would continue her efforts to restore normal order to a household that had been forever changed by the presence of a child who was neither slave nor son, but somehow both. The road to Camden stretched ahead of Samuel like a metaphor for the uncertain path his life would now follow. Behind him lay the only world he had ever known, with all its contradictions and cruelties. Ahead waited possibilities he could barely imagine, opportunities that came freighted with dangers he was only beginning to understand. The boy who had asked why the master looked like him was about to discover that some questions, once asked, change everything forever. Dr. Weatherby's household in Camden represented a different world entirely from the agricultural rhythms of plantation life. The doctor's residence, a substantial brick house on the town's main street, served multiple functions as family home, medical office, and informal academy for the slaves whose education served both humanitarian and practical purposes. Samuel's introduction to this environment marked the beginning of a transformation that would challenge every assumption he had developed about his place in Southern society. Augustus, the medical assistant who had worked with Dr. Weatherby for over 15 years, became Samuel's first teacher in the complex navigation required for educated slaves. A man in his 40s with scarred hands that testified to years of assisting with surgical procedures, Augustus possessed an intellect that had been carefully cultivated while remaining hidden from all but a select few. His lessons for Samuel went far beyond reading and writing to encompass the psychological skills necessary for survival in their unique position. "Knowledge is power," Augustus explained during one of their early conversations, "but displayed knowledge is danger. You must learn to be smart enough to be useful, but never so smart as to be threatening. The white folks who educate us need to believe they remain our superiors, even as they depend on our capabilities to maintain their own positions." Prudence, who managed Dr. Weatherby's correspondence and financial records, reinforced these lessons through her own example. A woman of perhaps 35 years, with hands stained perpetually with ink, and a mind capable of calculations that surpassed many educated white men, she demonstrated daily how intelligence could be wielded as a tool for advancement within the constraints of their society. Her interactions with the doctor's white patients and business associates were masterpieces of deference that concealed razor-sharp analytical abilities. Samuel's formal education began with basic literacy skills, but quickly expanded to encompass subjects that few white children of his age were studying. Dr. Weatherby believed in comprehensive intellectual development and introduced his young protégé to mathematics, natural philosophy, basic medical knowledge, and even rudimentary Latin. The boy's quick grasp of these subjects surprised even the doctor, who had expected intelligence but was unprepared for the depth of Samuel's curiosity and retention. The psychological adjustment to this new life proved more challenging than the intellectual demands. Samuel found himself caught between worlds in ways that created constant internal tension. In the doctor's household, he was encouraged to think, question, and learn with an intensity that fed his hungry mind. But beyond those walls, Camden society operated according to the same racial hierarchies that governed plantation life, and Samuel was forced to remember constantly which identity he could display in which circumstances. Letters from his mother arrived irregularly, carried by trusted intermediaries who moved between the plantation and town on various errands. These communications were necessarily brief and coded, expressing love and concern while avoiding any details that could prove dangerous if intercepted. Celia's messages spoke of seasonal changes, household news, and her prayers for Samuel's well-being, but between the lines, the boy could read his mother's longing and worry. Master Blackwood's influence over Samuel's new situation remained significant but carefully concealed. The financial arrangements that supported the boy's education and care were channeled through Dr. Weatherby in ways that maintained plausible deniability about their true source. Occasionally, the master would visit Camden on business and would find excuses to observe Samuel from a distance, checking on his progress while maintaining the fiction that no special relationship existed between them. As months passed and Samuel's education progressed, his understanding of his unique position deepened in ways that both empowered and troubled him. He began to grasp the broader implications of slavery as an economic and social system, understanding how his own mixed heritage represented both the contradictions inherent in that system and the potential for its eventual transformation. These realizations were intellectually fascinating but emotionally devastating for a boy still struggling to understand his own identity. The other residents of Camden gradually became aware of the unusually intelligent young slave in Dr. Weatherby's household, though none suspected the true extent of Samuel's education. He was observed reading medical texts that challenged even educated adults, assisting with procedures that required both manual skill and theoretical understanding, and demonstrating capabilities that seemed to exceed his supposed station. These observations generated conversations among the town's elite that reflected growing anxiety about the implications of educating slaves. Samuel's relationship with Dr. Weatherby evolved into something approaching mentorship, though both participants understood the limitations that their respective positions imposed. The doctor found genuine pleasure in nurturing such a promising intellect, while Samuel discovered in his teacher a model of how knowledge could be pursued for its own sake, rather than simply as a tool for survival. Their daily discussions ranged across topics that challenged conventional thinking about race, intelligence, and human potential. However, this intellectual flowering occurred against a backdrop of increasing political tension that would soon affect everyone in their community. The Compromise of 1850 had temporarily diffused national conflicts over slavery, but in Alabama, debates about the institution's future were intensifying among educated classes who understood that external pressures were mounting. Dr. Weatherby's household, with its unconventional approach to slave education, represented exactly the kind of experiment that critics of slavery pointed to as evidence of the system's internal contradictions. During this period, Samuel began experiencing what could only be described as an identity crisis that reflected his impossible position between two worlds. His education had given him intellectual tools to analyze his situation with a clarity that was psychologically devastating. He understood that his white heritage provided certain protections and opportunities, while his enslaved status negated any legal rights or social standing. This knowledge created a psychological burden that manifested in periods of depression and anger that worried his caretakers. The boy's emotional struggles were compounded by his physical development, which was making his resemblance to Master Blackwood increasingly pronounced. Visitors to Dr. Weatherby's household sometimes commented on Samuel's unusual features, speculating about his heritage in ways that made everyone uncomfortable. These observations reminded all concerned that the fiction supporting Samuel's presence in Camden was becoming harder to maintain as he matured. Margaret Blackwood's concerns about her brother's experiment proved prescient as reports of Samuel's capabilities reached social circles that included some of Alabama's most prominent families. Conversations at dinner parties and church gatherings began, including references to the remarkable young slave at Dr. Weatherby's house. Discussions that carried undertones of both admiration and unease. Some viewed the boy's education as evidence of Negro capability, while others saw it as proof that educating slaves created dangerous expectations and dissatisfaction. As 1851 dawned, Samuel faced his 9th birthday with a mix of pride in his accomplishments and uncertainty about his future. His education had proceeded beyond what anyone had initially imagined possible, but success brought its own complications. The more capable he became, the more questions his situation raised about the fundamental assumptions underlying their society. His very existence challenged beliefs about racial hierarchy that formed the foundation of Southern social order. The question that had started this journey, why the master looked like him, had evolved into dozens of other questions that seemed to multiply faster than they could be answered. Samuel now understood the biological and social reasons for his resemblance to Master Blackwood, but that understanding had opened up philosophical and moral inquiries that challenged the basic premises of the world in which he lived. His education had given him the tools to analyze his situation, but analysis only highlighted the contradictions and injustices that defined his existence. Dr. Weatherby himself was beginning to question the wisdom of the experiment he had undertaken. While Samuel's intellectual progress exceeded all expectations, the psychological costs of the boy's position were becoming increasingly apparent. The doctor worried that they were creating expectations that their society could never fulfill, preparing Samuel for a life that might not be possible within the constraints of Southern law and custom. As spring arrived in Camden, bringing with it the familiar rhythms of agricultural renewal, Samuel continued his studies while grappling with questions that had no easy answers. His situation remained unique in their community, representing both an extraordinary opportunity and a dangerous precedent that challenged fundamental assumptions about race, intelligence, and social order. The boy, who had begun by asking about physical resemblance, was now confronting mysteries of identity and belonging that would shape the rest of his life in ways none of them could yet imagine. The question that would ultimately expose everything was building toward its moment of expression, though no one yet realized how completely it would transform their carefully constructed arrangements. Samuel's education had given him not just knowledge, but the confidence to seek answers to questions that polite society preferred to leave unasked. And in a world built on fictions and silences, such questions had the power to bring down structures that had seemed permanent and unshakable. By the summer of 1851, Samuel's education under Dr. Weatherby had progressed to levels that would have been remarkable for any child of his age, regardless of race. His abilities in mathematics, natural philosophy, and medical theory had developed to the point where he could assist the doctor with procedures that required both intellectual sophistication and practical skill. However, this academic success was creating complications that none of them had fully anticipated when the arrangement began. The political climate in Alabama was growing increasingly volatile as debates over slavery's future intensified throughout the South. Dr. Weatherby found himself under scrutiny from neighbors who questioned the wisdom of educating slaves to such an advanced level. Whispered conversations in Camden's social circles suggested that the doctor's experiment was attracting attention from authorities who viewed educated slaves as potential threats to social stability. It was during this period of mounting tension that Samuel made a discovery that would force the final confrontation everyone had been avoiding. While organizing medical texts in Dr. Weatherby's study, he found a collection of correspondence between the doctor and Master Blackwood that detailed not just the financial arrangements supporting his education, but explicit acknowledgement of his parentage and discussions about his ultimate fate. The letters revealed that Master Blackwood had been planning to eventually manumit Samuel and send him north, where his education and light complexion might allow him to pass for white and build a life impossible in the South. However, these plans had been complicated by growing political tensions and Margaret Blackwood's increasingly vocal opposition to any arrangement that might expose the family to scandal. Samuel confronted Dr. Weatherby with the letters on a humid August afternoon that would forever mark the end of his childhood. The conversation that followed was the first completely honest discussion of his situation that the boy had ever experienced. Dr. Weatherby confirmed Samuel's parentage, explained the complex motivations behind his education, and revealed the uncertain plans for his future that hinged on political developments beyond their control. Your father wishes to give you opportunities that his position makes impossible to provide openly, the doctor explained. But the world is changing in ways that make our arrangement increasingly dangerous. There are those who would see your very existence as evidence of moral corruption that threatens the foundations of our society. The revelation that Master Blackwood had been planning his freedom created emotions in Samuel that were almost impossible to process. Joy at the prospect of liberation mixed with anger at having been kept ignorant of these plans. Understanding that his father cared enough to risk social standing for his welfare competed with resentment that this care had been expressed through secrecy and deception rather than open acknowledgement. Within weeks of Samuel's discovery, the careful balance maintaining their situation began to collapse. Margaret Blackwood, learning of her brother's manumission plans through household servants who had overheard conversations, threatened to expose the entire arrangement unless it was terminated immediately. Her ultimatum forced a crisis that had been building since Samuel first asked his devastating question years earlier. Master Blackwood arrived in Camden on a September morning, heavy with the weight of decisions that could no longer be postponed. His meeting with Dr. Weatherby and Samuel took place in the doctor's study, where the boy's education had flourished and where his future would now be determined. The conversation was formal yet emotionally charged, representing the closest the three of them had ever come to acknowledging the true nature of their relationships. "The situation has become untenable," Blackwood explained, his voice carrying exhaustion that reflected months of internal struggle. "Margaret threatens exposure that would destroy not just our family's reputation, but your safety as well. The political climate makes it impossible to proceed with manumission as planned." Samuel listened to this discussion of his fate with the composure that his education had taught him, but inside his emotions raged with the intensity of someone watching their dreams dissolve. The freedom that had seemed within reach was being withdrawn due to forces beyond his control, returning him to a limbo that was perhaps worse than never having hoped at all. Dr. Weatherby proposed an alternative that would allow Samuel to maintain some benefits of his education while removing him from the immediate danger of exposure. The boy would be sent to New Orleans, where the more complex racial hierarchies of that cosmopolitan city might allow him to function as a skilled artisan or even eventually purchase his own freedom. It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but offered Samuel some hope for a future beyond slavery. The final weeks of Samuel's time in Camden were marked by feverish preparation for a journey that would take him further from his mother than he had ever been. Dr. Weatherby provided him with forged papers documenting skills in carpentry and masonry that would make him valuable in New Orleans construction trades. More importantly, he gave Samuel letters of introduction to abolitionists who might assist his eventual escape to freedom in the North. Samuel's farewell to Dr. Weatherby was necessarily brief but deeply emotional. The man who had served as teacher, protector, and surrogate father pressed a small package into the boy's hands, containing money, additional documentation, and a letter explaining his true parentage for use, if circumstances ever made such revelation beneficial rather than dangerous. The journey to New Orleans in October 1851 marked the end of one chapter in Samuel's life and the beginning of another that would test everything his education had taught him about survival and self-determination. He traveled in the company of a slave trader who believed he was simply transporting another piece of property, unaware that his cargo possessed intellectual capabilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of slavery itself. Years would pass before Samuel saw his mother again, and when they were reunited, both had been transformed by experiences that tested the limits of human endurance. Celia had aged beyond her years from worry and separation, while Samuel had grown into a young man whose education and experiences had given him perspectives that few of his generation could claim. Master Blackwood never publicly acknowledged his son, but he followed Samuel's eventual success in New Orleans through reports that confirmed the wisdom of the education he had arranged. The boy who had asked why the master looked like him grew into a man who used his unusual background and exceptional education to help other slaves find paths to freedom through the Underground Railroad. The question that had started this journey was ultimately answered not through words, but through actions that proved the fundamental equality of human potential, regardless of the circumstances of birth. Samuel's story became part of the larger narrative of slavery's internal contradictions, demonstrating how the system's own hypocrisies created the conditions for its eventual destruction. Margaret Blackwood's fears about exposure proved unfounded, but her victory in preventing immediate manumission came at a cost that haunted her for the rest of her life. She had preserved her family's reputation while condemning a gifted child to years of unnecessary bondage, a choice that reflected the moral blindness that made slavery possible but ultimately unsustainable. Dr. Weatherby continued his medical practice and his quiet work, educating selected slaves, though he never again attempted an experiment as ambitious as Samuel's education. The experience had taught him valuable lessons about the courage required to challenge social norms and the personal costs of moral compromise in an immoral system. The records of Samuel's time in Camden were carefully preserved by Dr. Weatherby, who understood their historical significance, even if their immediate impact was limited. These documents would eventually contribute to scholarly understanding of slavery's complexities and the remarkable individuals who transcended its limitations through intelligence, determination, and the courage to ask questions that others feared to voice. In 1862, Samuel's story came full circle when he returned to Alabama as a free man wearing the uniform of the Union Army. He served as a scout and interpreter, using his knowledge of the region and his understanding of slavery's operations to assist in the liberation of other enslaved people. His military service represented both personal vindication and symbolic victory over the system that had once claimed to own him. The plantation where Samuel had been born was among those he helped liberate during the Civil War's final campaigns. Standing in the kitchen where his mother had worked and where he had first learned to question the contradictions around him, Samuel reflected on the journey that had taken him from enslaved child to educated freeman to Union soldier. Celia lived to see her son's triumph, though she did not survive long enough to witness the full flowering of the freedom that his questions had helped create. Her faith that education and courage could overcome even the most entrenched systems of oppression had been vindicated by events she could never have imagined when she first tried to explain to a confused boy why he resembled his oppressor. Master Blackwood died in 1864, never having publicly acknowledged his son, but having lived long enough to see the world that had shaped their impossible relationship crumble around him. His final words, according to witnesses, were an apology spoken to empty air, suggesting that conscience had finally overwhelmed the social pressures that had prevented him from claiming Samuel openly. The question, "Why does the master look like me, mother?" had exposed everything, just as the most innocent questions sometimes do. It revealed the moral contradictions that made slavery unsustainable, the human cost of systems built on racial fictions, and the power of education to transform individuals and ultimately society itself. Samuel's story became part of the larger narrative of American freedom, proof that human potential cannot be permanently suppressed by legal bondage or social prejudice. The boy who had been born into slavery but educated in secret grew into a man who helped destroy the system that had claimed to own him, demonstrating that some questions once asked change everything forever. The records suggest that Samuel lived until 1903, dying as a respected educator and community leader in Chicago. His final years were devoted to establishing schools for freed slaves, ensuring that other children would have access to the education that had transformed his own life. He never forgot the question that had started his journey toward freedom, and he never stopped believing in the power of knowledge to overcome even the most entrenched systems of oppression. The slave boy's question had indeed exposed everything, not through dramatic revelation, but through the gradual accumulation of courage, education, and determination that ultimately proved more powerful than the chains that had once bound him.